Now let's move on to Gerardo Ceballos, who's going to talk to us about extinction and the sixth extinction and the future of humanity. So Gerardo Ceballos is a professor at the Institute of Ecology at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. He is an ecologist and a conservationist known internationally for his pioneering research into extinction risk in birds, mammals, or other vertebrates and humane paths to ecological sustainability. His work underlines the extreme urgency of taking massive global actions to save humanity's crucial life support systems. And he's going to talk to us today about the sixth mass extinction and the future of humanity. Here is Professor Ceballos.
Hi, thank you very much for the kind of invitation to talk with you today. I'm going to talk about population and species losses, the sixth mass extinction, and the future of humanity. Many years ago, the great Aldo Leopold said that we live in a world of wounds. And if we look around, this is really what is happening. The place is covered by wounds that we have created on Earth by our activities. And what I do as a scientist, well, I am an ecologist from the National University of Mexico. And what I do as a scientist is basically a basic research. I love to do research, but then that research, I do it with conservation of endangered species, the establishment and management of protected areas, conservation policies and outreach. With my study group, for example, we have been able to create almost 2% of the Mexican land converted into protected areas. We work with jaguar, we work with prairie dog, we work with bison. And we do a conservation policy in the sense that we tried that our research, what we find in our research, become models and then become policies throughout the country. Some of the facts that are very important to know is the first one, probably to understand the magnitude of the extinction problem, is that only 1% of the global biodiversity, it is known. Only 1%, meaning most of the species, alive, plants, animals, and microorganisms, are unknown to science. That means that every time that we destroy a forest, we're destroying literally hundreds of thousands, even millions of species that are known to science. And an example, in the last 10 years, we have discovered more of 600 species of mammals. Since 2000, we have discovered 80 new species of monkeys. Just this year, between December and last December, 2 new species of whale were discovered in the waters of Mexico and the US, one in the Gulf and one in the Pacific. That's the magnitude, that's the wealth of the species that live on Earth. This is, for example, these are the animals found in a single trip, a collecting trip, monitoring species in the depths of the Pacific. And in this particular one, they found the largest animal on Earth, and a worm-like animal, 47 meters long. Unfortunately, as I said, what we're happening right now, we're facing an unprecedented biodiversity loss. This is probably the most urgent problem and one of the most challenging problems that humanity has faced. The current situation is that we have so many severe global environmental problems, and all of them are caused by human population growth, inequity, consumption, and the use of inefficient technologies like fossil fuels. This has caused us these global problems like climate disruption, habitat loss, overexploitation, emerging diseases, and so on, has pushed us to a larger magnitude of species and population losses on the one hand, and whole ecosystems on the other. And together, this means that we're losing ecosystem services and goods, And those ecosystem services and goods, as I'm going to explain, are essential to maintaining life on Earth in general and human life on Earth in particular. We recently published with Paul Ehrlich and other people this paper underestimating the challenges for avoiding a ghastly future. And basically what we find in this paper is that even our predictions, even what we know, doesn't give us a whole good idea of the magnitude of the problem when this all put together. Even us as scientists working on these very dreadful problems cannot grasp the magnitude of the problems. And particularly in what I am expert on is the extinction rates. And a few years ago with Paul Ehrlich and other colleagues, what we did is to try to analyze if the current extinction rates were normal in the sense were similar rates to what happened in the last few million years, or they were elevated, meaning that we are entering a mass extinction. And to be honest, when we started the study, we knew that the current rates will be elevated because so many species are becoming extinct, but we never thought that what we want to find out was as bad as we find. And basically, almost 1,000 vertebrate species has become extinct in the last 500 years, most of them in the last 100 years. Fortunately for us, there is two kinds of information that allows to put this into perspective. First, in the last 600 million years, there has been 5 mass extinction, and those mass extinction basically are extinction rates, periods where extinction rates goes and become very elevated, much more elevated to the normal extinction rates or background extinction rates. And those 5 extinction rates, mass extinction rates, have several characteristics in common. On the one hand, they were caused by a catastrophe, a natural catastrophe like the impact of a meteorite. Second, they were very fast in geological terms, happening in hundreds of thousands or a few million years. And third, they evaporated 70% or more of all the species on Earth. The second important part when we did this study is that our colleague, Tony Barnowski from Berkeley and his colleagues have put together a few years ago a paper where they have been able to evaluate what was the extinction rates of mammals in the last few million years. And that study was based on the records of literally hundreds of thousands records of fossil mammals. And what they found basically is a complex scenario, but the extinction rate, the normal extinction rate in the last 2 million years basically can be translated to this. You will expect to lose 2 species for every 10,000 species present at a time, every 100 years. In other words, in a particular century, if you have 10,000 species, in normal time, you will expect to extinction. If you have 20,000 species present, you will find it for extinction. And if you have only 5,000 species, you will expect 1 extinction. That becomes an incredibly important piece of knowledge that will allow us to understand what was the current extinction rate. And based on our results, we published this paper, Accelerated Modern Human-Induced Species Losses, Entering the 6th Mass Extinction, because what we found out was that the species that has become in the last 500 years in general, but mostly in the last century in particular, we can see here in this, in the left, you can see the much elevated rates of mammals, all the vertebrates, birds, and so on. You see on the bottom, a dotted line, that will be the background extinction rate. That will be if the current extinction rate was similar to what happened in the last few million years, then the lines, the color lines, will be below that. But what you can see, it is much higher. That's the first thing. I mean, the extinction rate in the last 500 years has been much more elevated than the background extinction rate of the last few million years. And the second, you can see on the right, see, that there is almost a perfect correlation between extinction rate and human population loss. It's 0.999. That means that a human population, it is related to the loss of this species almost perfectly. In summary, from that paper, what we find out is that the species lost in the last 100 years of vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, should be lost in 10,000 years following normal times extinction rates. And now, based on our data and the data of many other groups on plants and invertebrates, and butterflies, and so on, the extinction rates are between 10 to 10,000 faster, meaning what we lost in the last 100 years should have lost in between 100 and 10,000 times faster. This means species lost in the last 100 years would have been lost between 10,000 to 100,000 years. The number is so big that it's impossible to understand. The magnitude of this is impossible to understand. But then, what we have focused our studies is not only populations, it's not only species what is matter, but it's also population extinction. Because a species become extinct when all its populations are lost. That means, by definition then, that the population extinction is more severe than a species extinction. And it will also mention why population extinction become very relevant at the local and regional scales. We published this paper in 2017, and as the previous one become also viral in the internet. It was covered in all the news and newspapers, blogs, etc. Somebody made an estimate that probably between 100 and 500 million people were exposed to this paper in the first 4 weeks after it was published. And here, what we look out, if you see the map on the right, there's the historic and the current population geographic range of lions. And as you can see, lions has become, they have disappeared for a massive, basically from all Asia, except from a tiny population in India, in the Gir forest. And also, it is all fragmented that has appeared from many places in Africa. When we did this infograph, something like 10 years ago, there were 34,000 lions remaining. Now there are around 23,000. That's how fast things are going. So we call this paper biological annihilation via the ongoing 6 mass extinction signaled by vertebrate population losses and decline. Because what we managed to show here is that more than 27,000 species of vertebrates, 32% of them are losing population. And this includes very abundant, less abundant, rare, and very rare species, the whole array of species. So, in other words, we're losing species at a really fast rate, and we're losing populations at a really fast rate. And we call it annihilation, the biological annihilation, because this is a really unprecedented, massive assault on wildlife, on animals. And you can see here the population had declined of the forest elephants in Africa, and every 30 minutes an African elephant is killed illegally for its ivory. As 8% of the population is lost every year, and at this rate there could be no elephants in 10 or 15 years. There are studies by other groups. This is from the Living Planet, from World Wildlife Fund, and it shows that 39% of the terrestrial vertebrates has declined around, that terrestrial vertebrates have declined around 39% between 1970 and 2010, and 76% of the freshwater species like frogs and toads, and 39% of the marine species. This is what it shows, is that the massive losses of animals, individual animals and populations. And just to give you an idea of all the biomass left of birds on Earth, 70% are basically chicken and other poultry. And only 30% of that biomass is divided among 11,000 species of wild birds. So the concentration of biomass is gigantic on poultry. The same thing is happening with when we see livestock and so on. So what are the causes of the decline globally? You know them all, but basically exploitation, hunting and overfishing, habitat degradation, habitat loss, climate change, invasive species, pollution, diseases, and so on. These are the causes directly or indirectly related to human activities that are putting species and populations to extinction. And I give you an example that not only big animals are being lost. This is what's happened with invertebrates. This is an example in Germany. 75% of the biomass of insects were lost in 27 years. Well, we know, and it will be discussed in further detail, that population growth, consumption, and technology are causing these problems. The drivers, the proximate drivers are first, habitat loss. Just to give you an idea, 90% of the tropical forests of Asia remaining in 2000 were lost in 19 years. And what we can see in this map is those places, dark places, are areas where most land is under urban landscapes, agriculture, or cattle. We know that global climate disruption is starting to hit hard. It will be much harder in the future, and it will cause more impact on population and species. The other driver that I want to emphasize here that is incredibly important is overexploitation and illegal trade. We know now that the illegal trade is so big that, for instance, animals like pangolin has lost an estimated 96% of the population in the last 20 years. A pangolin can cost $5,000 in a restaurant in China. And this is a pangolin pit where these pangolins, 3,000 pangolins, were confiscated and are being destroyed in Indonesia, I think. Wildlife trades and habitat loss are the two of the root causes responsible for the brunt of the problem of losing populations and the species. And we're still waiting for the big impact of climate change. And the recent COVID, we all know that the recent COVID and many other pandemic and epidemic zoonotic diseases are related to illegal trade of animals. And see the famous wet markets on the left. You will see what they call wet market because the floor are wet with blood and water and all kind of waste. And on the left, on the right, you can see this person eating while he's eating in a place where they have cages with animals in very filthy conditions, very unethical conditions. You have there wild and domestic animals in the perfect conditions to get diseases transmitted to each other. This is why COVID jumped from a wild animal to domestic animals or to humans. And this is what has happened in the last 40 years with something like 40 to 50 epidemic, some of them very deadly diseases like Ebola. To give you an idea of the size of the problem, in China alone, over 100 million individuals of wild animals are used every single year, generating $74 billion in profit. That's more than all the combined profit from the US market, beef market profits. So why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, it matters for so many reasons. It matters. There are political, there are religious, there are cultural, there are ethical, there are moral, there are economic reasons. Perhaps the most important, it matters because we get the environmental services that are all the benefits provided by wild plants, animals, and microorganisms to humans and to other animals and other plants. The clean water, essential for human survival, the proper combination for the gases of the atmosphere, and so on, are environmental services provided by the wild plants and animals of this planet. Indeed, there could be no life on Earth if there were no wild plants and animals. And we're killing them, so we're killing the possibilities, we're destroying the possibilities of Earth to maintain life in general and to maintain human life in particular. Another example of some of these ecosystem services is pollination. 75% of the crops that we use, human use, are pollinated totally or partially by animals. Bats, insects, bees, birds. Well, what can we do? So basically, what we can do is what we're doing today. Is that we have to stop being spectators. We have to become actors. And in this particular sense, it is incredibly important to understand that by losing populations, we're losing the ecosystem services at the local and the regional scale. And this is important to mention because, for instance, it doesn't matter that there are jaguars in Brazil, jaguars that disappear in Mexico, because the role that jaguars play in the forests of Mexico is gone. Those species, local species of population, are like global species. Local extinctions of populations are like global extinctions of species. This is a paper was published recently and shows particular trends. If we do nothing, how can we go to ruin? But if we do an effort in the next few years, in the next few decades, we can probably help to change the whole outcome. We think that what's happened with plants and animals in the next 15 years, what we can do to save most of the species in danger with extinction in the next 10 to 15 years is what is going to define what's happened with biodiversity on Earth in the long run. And I finish with this. We're working on a new initiative. It's called People versus Extinction, where we are building this platform to galvanize mass education, engagement, and action in response to climate change and species extinction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ceballos, for this talk. So if you wouldn't mind turning your camera on, I'll ask you a few questions now. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, essentially, we're in a situation where a lot of the previous talks have highlighted the need to put an end to poverty, to increase the ability of developing countries to reach a level of wealth that will make other things possible, such as, for example, access to clean water, for example, just to name one. But with increased wealth and development, usually comes increased appetite for meat and increased consumption, increased patterns of overconsumption that could be damaging to biodiversity. Just before in the chat, Leilani Munter was mentioning the effect that all of us eating meat can have on the environment, but for you as well, with the wild animal trade, this could have catastrophic effects on wildlife. So how do you think we can reconcile the need for to lift countries out of poverty with the impact that that this will have on biodiversity?
Well, thank you. That's a good question. It is important to recognize that the way we think lifting people from poverty, it requires to increase consumption and ways that we do in the West. And actually, you can get people out of poverty while protecting their lands and protecting the wildlife, and they will be probably consuming less, but they will be out of poverty. And I give you an example. For instance, in southern Mexico, we're working with communities who were in poverty, and we are helping them to protect their tropical forests by with a couple of things. On the one hand, we're helping them to develop economic activities that are compatible with conservation. And on the other hand, we're paying them ecosystem services or conservation services for protecting the forests. And it is perfectly compatible at that level, at the level of regional level, is perfectly compatible to have conservation of biodiversity and getting people out of poverty. What is incredibly complicated, and it will be extremely difficult, is if we want to get people out of poverty and keep trying to give them the same appetite for overconsumption that we do most of the affluent people of the world. That won't work. And I think the transition to, if there is a transition, as other speakers have said, in different topics towards more sustainable things, that will happen in the coming years, in the coming decades. What is incredibly important to understand that of all the problems that we have discussed here, perhaps with the exception of the nuclear holocaust, all of them can be solved with enough time. But species extinction is the only probably truly irreversible environmental problem. Once you lose a species, when it's gone, you cannot recreate it. So we have to divide this into periods. What is going to happen in the next 15, 20 years, and then what is going to happen afterwards. And what is right now incredibly important is to try to keep as much land, wild land, as possible, and to protect as many species as possible. And by looking at ways to do that without, on the one hand, destroying the species, but on the other hand, trying to get these people from poverty. What I don't know how to do it is once you increase your wealth and you just measure well-being in terms of economic growth, I don't know if that will be compatible. What I can say that there are many examples throughout the world where if we put a proper funding in the local communities, you can have working ecosystems, both in terms of maintaining the biodiversity and in terms of getting people out of poverty and having a much better standard of life. One thing that you have to recognize, and I would say this, is that by destroying, I mean, many times in many countries, like right now, the Mexican government thinks that destroying the forests and destroying the environment and get people a little bit more of money, that's better standard of living, and that is perfectly incorrect. If you don't have a healthy environment, it doesn't matter if you have more money. It doesn't work that way.
I agree, and I think your diagrams showed very clearly a correlation between the reduction in the biodiversity and the increase in human population. I went to Uganda for a research trip in 2017, where they are putting in place the kind of policies and incentives that you mentioned by increasing tourism and showing the nature reserves as a source of income for local populations through tourism. But just today, there's an article on the BBC about lions that have been killed and chopped into pieces by the local population. So I suppose the more local populations get in contact, physical contact with the natural reserves, the more risk and danger there is for these local people that they'll be attacked by wild animals. And so there is a limit, I believe, to the incentives that can be given when people fear for their life. but this friction between the natural world and the human world is occurring because a human population is growing beyond the limits of the natural reserve. So we have a question here from Tom about did you find also a correlation between extinction rates and the size of the global economy, or did you only look for a correlation between extinction rates and overpopulation?
No, that's a very good question. No, we have also done the correlation with the economic growth, and they are not as perfect, but they are very closely related. So yeah, clearly this is the result of overpopulation, but also of overconsumption. And we also know that, and this is not a direct correlation, but I mean, the more land we use for agriculture and pasture, the more species were being lost. It is important to understand that if we continue having this overpopulation on the one hand, overconsumption at the expenses of the wildlife, wild habitats and wildlife, there is no way we can get out of coping with global warming and all these problems. And probably you all know, and I will just repeat it here for the sake of it, but we all know that this coronavirus pandemic is related to the destruction of habitat and the illegal trade of animals. And there has been so many, I mean, the illegal trade is so gigantic now. It produces as much money as drugs and human trafficking and so on. And it is less appreciated as a problem, but that's the root of this pandemic. And Paul Ehrlich said at the beginning of this symposium that the complexity of biodiversity and producing environmental goods and services and then well-being to society is very complex on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is clearly, now there are so many studies, so much information showing that if we continue this trend of destroying the natural habitats and getting so many species extinct, there is no way we can cope with climate change and other problems in the near future. I mean, to me, the extinction, the 6 mass extinction crisis is probably right now the most pressing problem, environmental problem, because it's irreversible, it's going incredibly fast, and there is not much time to work to do something to solve it. The good news is there's still some time. If we manage to put that together, we may save many species and many ecosystems that are required to face all the environmental problems.
That was going to be actually my next question, because with your example of the pangolins and then the wet markets, it's clear that it's an international trade, and so it requires international cooperation to solve it. There's basically such a disparity between rich countries that can afford these illegal wildlife products and the poor countries where selling a pangolin is going to guarantee a fortune to the person who does it. So how do we deal with this disparity worldwide, and how do we ensure a global cooperation system to tackle the issue in a way that takes into account economic disparities?
Well, that's another good question. Well, on the one hand, I think we require now a new framework, a new international framework where we can really start to deal with this completely new dimension of the scale, the scope of the problem. We need a kind of an international Paris Agreement for climate change, something similar to illegal trade. For instance, CITES, the Convention for dealing with the trade of endangered species, is not working at all anymore. CITES, many species are becoming extinct because of legally, because you can trade them legally with permits by CITES. The disparity is gigantic and horrible. You can get people in Mexico or in Bolivia or in other places to get they get something like $70 for a jaguar bones, and and teeth, and they've been sold by thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in China and Southeast Asia. So we need, on the one hand, this new framework, and unfortunately, the world is awakening on this. And second, we need completely different